Hi, I'm going to talk about the Gun Control Act of 1968. The Gun Control Act of 1968 and its ties into the issue of mental health. This is a federal law that prohibits the sale of firearms to certain categories of people. These people who are identified in the policy restrictions include those who are considered high risk. Those high risk individuals include convicted felons, fugitives from justice, illegal aliens, individuals who have renounced their citizenship, dishonorably discharged veterans, unlawful users of substances, and persons deemed quote unquote adjudicated as mental defective. And this is defined by the ATF, or the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. A little bit of the historical background of the GCA of 1968. Essentially, there was no regulations, no laws that had ever got involved in gun control. There was no federal entity that ever regulated access to guns until this law, which was in 1968. There were two things previously right before, which was the 1934 National Firearms Act, which Congress did focus on restricting just the use of machine guns, and this was in response to the gangster era that was going on in the early 1930s. There was also the Haynes versus United States that invalidated the NFA, and those two actions paved way for the GCA of 1968 to be passed. So the problems that necessitated this policy included a few things. There was the cultural shift that was going on in the 1960s, that social change that was going on. There was a lot of violence that started to happen. The main one was the assassination in 1963 of President JFK. There was also the 1964 urban riots and the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. So those ones were the main problems that kind of pushed Congress to make some action when it came to gun control. I'm going to talk a little bit about the description of the policy. So the goals of the policy, of course, were there was many issues that it wanted to address. It made it so that individuals did not have to register the guns that were already in their possession, but it banned imports of guns that were not being used for hunting or sports. It made 18 years of age the minimum age in which somebody could purchase a firearm. And it also included serial numbers for tracking purposes. And then this was the first time that it made actual restrictions to persons who could purchase a firearm. And that's when it included those who had the mental health label given to them, that they could not purchase a firearm. So is this policy just and democratic? I don't think it is. I don't think the policy is just and democratic because it singles out those who are deemed, in quotes, mentally defective. So yeah, the goals were to bring down the rates of gun violence, but how is it in correlation with those who have mental health issues? Does that warrant them from being prohibited from access to firearms? Does it contribute to the greater social equality? Well, it doesn't. There's definitely not. It's not contributing because it's precipitating the stigma that we have around mental health issues. It's putting those who are deemed mentally unfit or mentally ill, it's saying that they are equivalent to persons that are creating more violence, more gun violence. And so it's really not creating any social equality. And is it consistent with the values of social work? And we as social workers are committed to social justice. So if we see in the community that there are populations of people who who are being signaled out and stigmatized more than that is against our values. The dignity and worth of a person is another value that is not consistent with the gun control policy, because it does identify those who are mentally ill and signals them out and further stigmatizes and creates bias. Also, the value of integrity and trust is another social work value that it challenges, because persons who are deemed mentally unfit to own firearms, it creates an imbalance of trust between our patients and our clients, when if we consider them to be dangerous, are we supposed to signal them out, or are we supposed to contact somebody if we know that they have a firearm? So this leads to a lot of over-inclusive reporting policies and things of that nature. And is it consistent with recovery-oriented social work? And the National Alliance on Mental Health Illness maintains that most people with mental illness are not violent. They report that, in fact, individuals with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crimes versus creating the crime or perpetuating the crimes. And it also recognizes that the acts of violence by people with mental illnesses are usually the result of lack of much needed mental health access, which is the real problem that we've got going on. So looking at a comparative international analysis, we have a huge gun culture here in the United States. No other developed country in the world has anywhere near the same rate of gun violence as we do. Compared to Canada, we have 6 times more of the homicide rate, and compared to Germany, we have 16 times that. So our policies are definitely not helping anything, but many Americans consider gun ownership part of their heritage, part of their birthright. So that has a lot to do with our gun culture and how we identify ourselves. The 2 main camps that are against any gun control policies, especially the GCA, or the National Rifle Association, the NRA, and the American Civil Liberties Union. And these 2 organizations are very active. The National Rifle Association, of course, because they don't want anyone being limited to firearm access, and the ACLU, because they really do believe that it is a breach of their Second Amendment rights, especially with no due process. There are 2 ideological camps that are in play in the gun control debate. Definitely the Republicans are more into their value system is represented in like more individualism, personal freedoms, less government control in people's lives. So they tend to back less restrictive gun policies. Former President Obama, who was a Democrat, introduced legislation that would put more support and measures on gun control, excuse me, especially after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. And that really didn't go too far. So the battle between the 2 ideological camps continues to go on, and unless they come to some kind of compromise, it's going to continue. The National Alliance on Mental Health states that there is no sound evidence that there is a relationship between people with mental illness and violence, and this was by NAMI. And so that's something that we really need to take a look at with further research, and especially the research that's been going on since all of the shootings that have taken place. We really need to focus on that. And I forgot to mention that the media and the school shootings and the mass shootings, the issue of stigma and media and mental illness are so heavily tied to each other, because that creates and creates that bias and continues that stigma that we have. So in conclusion, future policies that are pursued should not further stigmatize individuals with mental illness or discourage them from seeking treatment, because that's the big thing. We don't want to restrict anybody from feeling like they can get treatment. The evidence has been shown that there's a large majority and other data that the prevalence of gun violence and the correlation to individuals with mental illness, it's just too complicated. It's multifaceted. it's just too broad. When we narrow people into this category of being mentally ill and then equating that to having higher rates of violence and then restricting access to guns, we have to be careful how we do that. So despite good intentions on the part of the policy to protect you as citizens, the policy does take away the rights of individuals with mental illness. It creates or it perpetuates that stereotype, it perpetuates the stigma, and we're just worried that that will restrict people from going to get evaluation and treatment. So early identification, intervention, treatment, support, especially to those with co-occurring issues, and crisis intervention, that needs to be top priority. And that's my presentation. Thank you. And in conclusion, some of the things that I kind of, after doing the research and looked at, as far as there wasn't a lot of sound research that correlated mental illness and higher rates of gun violence. With a lot of the research articles that I looked at, these are some of the recommendations that they had put in place, which were making sure that there were future policies that pursued to not further stigmatize individuals, because that definitely had to do with them not being able to seek treatment or want to seek treatment, which that's not a good thing. And also that, people with mental health issues, there's a wide range, and to make that correlation between gun violence and persons with mental illness is just too broad, just way too broad. So more research is definitely needed. And despite good intentions on the part of the policy to protect citizens, it does still take away rights of individuals with no due process and without solid evidence that they pose higher risks than others. And the main thing is making sure that we get early identification, intervention, treatment, support, especially when there's co-occurring issues like substance abuse or past violent situations or past history of violence, and making sure crisis intervention is also a priority. And that is the conclusion to my review of the Gun Control Act of 1968. Thank you.